Yep, the engine sits way too far down and there's nothing I can really do until I correct it. See, I can't really do much about the drive shafts or the exhaust until I've got that engine position final. So it makes sense to change all of that now before I go too far down the rabbit hole and then it becomes harder to fix later on. What you're seeing here is me using a laser line level to mark the current position of the engine relative to the car, and then what I'm doing is just marking that position on the chassis itself, and then I use the same laser line level later on to work out just how much I've managed to move that engine in relation to its initial position. It's also pretty handy because it means I can use it to make sure that the engine is square to the chassis as well. Once everything's all marked up, the engine can come out and I can start removing all of the mounts. What I'm doing here is I'm taking the OEM mounts and sticking them on the engine and the gearbox, and the reason I want to do that is just to see, just by chance, whether these will fit in an elevated engine position. When I originally tested these, I tried to get the engine as low down in the chassis as possible and these just didn't fit. So before I go any further, I'm just going to try and install the engine in place with these mounts on and then see where I'm at. As you can see, the gearbox mounting bracket here is in the way, so I'm going to draw around it to mark its position and then I'll remove it from the car now. So what's apparent now that we've got the mounts installed is that the whole assembly is now too wide to fit within the chassis rails. So I'll remove the gearbox mount and just see whether I can use the engine mount. But what we're finding here, if you look at these lines, is that I can't get the engine close enough to the driver's side because that mount is just too thick and it just pushes the engine towards the passenger side, which I don't want. So that mount comes off and then my original mount can go back on because it's a lot lower profile. If we have a little peek under the bonnet with it closed, you can see there's actually quite a lot of room above the engine. This was something I was really worried about when I initially installed the engine. I was worried about that intake manifold hitting the bonnet, but it turns out I got tons of room up there, so there's definitely scope to move the whole thing up and give me a bit more oil pan clearance. I also want to try and move the engine back a little bit as well. This is just to give me a little bit more room for the radiator and fan combination. At the moment, that fan is right up against the gearbox and there isn't really an awful lot of room to play with. You can just about see what looks like a mounting lug there in front of the starter motor. I'm going to cut that off because I don't think it's needed for anything and it stops me from being able to install the fan properly. With the engine lifted a little bit, you can see there's tons of room under there now. You can see the bottom of the wishbone mounts and that's now the lowest point of the car. The sump is actually above that, which is good. It's pretty certain now that I'm not going to have to worry about smashing the oil pan on anything. And the drive shafts are in a much higher position as well, which means that when it comes to lowering the car, I don't need to worry too much about the angle being too high. Another concern I had was that the intake manifold was going to be way too high and the bonnet would hit it, but it turns out that even if I elevate the engine as high as I have done, you can still close the bonnet with only a small clearance issue, which I can easily cut with a grinder to allow the bonnet to close properly. Peeking inside again, we can see with the new elevated position that we've got room above the intake manifold, and if you look closely you can see the radiator cap is still higher than that coolant flange on the side of the manifold. Taking a break from that for the moment, I managed to get myself a new tool, this bandsaw, which I got for about £200 on Facebook Marketplace. It's clearly seen some signs of use and it definitely needs a little bit of work to get it to cut straight. On this test piece I'm cutting here, it cuts through really well, but once I measured it with a square, it was definitely not cutting straight. Here I'm swapping out the blade for a slightly higher TPI, and whilst I'm at it I'm going to completely readjust everything, and then when doing another test cut you can already see when looking top down that it's cutting a lot straighter. And a quick check with a square shows that I've got this dialed in nicely. One thing I wanted to do was make it a lot easier to move this thing around the workshop. The existing mount that comes with the bandsaw is not the best thing, and moving it around is more hassle than it's worth. So I made this framework out of some old scrap angle steel, painted it with some Por 15, put some casters on it, and now I can move the whole thing around nice and easily with basically no effort. Back at the engine mounts again, we're going to try out a new design. This time I'm going to try and replicate what Volkswagen did and use a plinth rather than a bracket that holds a bushing like I was using before. The problem with what I was doing before is that I was trying to replicate what the Micra had, and given that I was already having to make such drastic changes to the chassis, it probably makes more sense to just try and replicate what Volkswagen have done. So what I'm doing here is I'm just cutting out some uprights, which are shaped to the contours of the wheel tub and the chassis rail. Right, so here's a little bit of progress. Did a lot of this off camera because I just needed to get on with it. What you're looking at here is the beginnings of me boxing this out. These two are just for strength, so you're going to have a plate on top of there, and this just gives a bit of downward strength and spreads it out over the chassis rails. These will also add a little bit of strength as well because these are pretty strong, and it will be capped off at the front and then maybe neatened up on the sides. But before I do any of that, I first need to just make sure that these are all leveled off. This line here is the height that I want the top of this plinth to be. Come down to the sort of head on, you can see that this is a little bit too tall, so I'm going to have to chop the heads off of these and just make it flat. And what you might notice is that these welds look like sponges, and that's because my welder isn't working properly, or at least the regulator on my welder isn't working properly. So whilst I was doing all that, I was dealing with some weirdness with the welder, and I've been using this welder for, well, maybe well over a year now, since I started the channel, since I started the project, and it's been okay. I've been using the disposable CO2 bottles on the back here, these things. It's just CO2, pure CO2. This one has been fine. CO2 isn't exactly the best thing to be welding thin metal with, but it's just what I had and it's been okay. So when that ran out, I knew that I needed to update this whole system with a bottle, like a big one that goes on the back of here, now that I have a cart. The initial outlay for one of those is pretty high, so I decided to just get another bottle for now, just to get me back on the road. And whilst I was there, I decided to have a look at getting this is the CO2 argon mix. So we got 86% argon, 14% CO2, which is going to be much better for doing thin metal, like I'm mostly doing. It'll probably do anything up to maybe 5 or 6 mil. I'm not really welding anything higher than that. Anyway, I thought that would be okay. Started using it, no problem, but because I'm still using this regulator, which might as well just be an on-off switch, it's supposed to go between 0 and 6, but realistically, nothing comes out unless it's on 6. So it's basically manufactured waste. Inconsistent to say the least. So that porous weld you saw just then, well, this is a weld I've just done with it. Okay, still not great, but it's not porous anymore. So something's weird with this thing, I don't know. But another weird thing that it was doing, and I don't think I've changed anything else, that sound you get when you MIG weld. Typically when you MIG weld in your short circuit MIG welding, that crackling sound you get is because you're short circuiting the wire to the welding puddle. That's where you get that crackling sound. But what this was doing after I changed over to that gas was it wasn't making that noise anymore. It was like, instead of a crackling sound, it was more like a hum. It was making a humming noise, and instead of like sparks coming out of it, it was like a plasma. I don't think this machine should be capable of doing that, but that's what I was seeing, and I didn't do anything to make it do that apart from change the gas. Now, I did understand when I was looking this up that if you do change the gas to like an argon gas, then you are more likely to be able to achieve spray transfer, but not at the type that I'm using, this 14% stuff. And I'm pretty sure the voltage doesn't go high enough on this thing to allow me to do that. But I don't know that because this welder doesn't use a voltage dial. It uses these switches. I got 1, 2, and then min and max of 1 and 2. I've got 4 voltage settings, and then I've got my wire feed. Those are my 2 controls that I have. So if I am somehow making the voltage go higher, I haven't got a clue. If there's any welders who are watching that either know this welder or just in general understand how all this works, then feel free to educate me in the comments. But yeah, it's weird. It's not doing it anymore. I haven't changed anything again. Don't know. By the way, I'm using 0.8mm wire, if that makes any difference. But what that meant was that when I was trying to weld, you see this bit down here? So just down there, you can see a gash. And that is because when I was cutting the old mount out with the angle grinder, I was not very accurate with it. So I ended up sort of slicing through the wheel tub here. Not a big deal. Should be able to just weld that back up. But when I was trying to weld it up, it was so hot that it was just burning through, even if I turned the wire feed down to basically nothing. If I turned the voltage down, then it would just keep on, it would just keep like zapping it. It sounded like a machine gun. So I had to turn the voltage up to stop it doing that. But then it just kept burning through, even if I turned the wire feed down to like 1. So I've not been able to really fix this, it just kept blowing through. Doing it again. The porosity might just be because it's dirty. Alright, so I suspect that what's happening here is, so the porosity is either because you don't have enough gas, like shielding gas, or because you've got some contaminants in the weld. I've cleaned the surface of this fairly thoroughly. I say fairly, I mean, I guess it can never be 100% clean. But while I brushed it, went over it with some acetone, just like I do with any other weld, and I've not had this problem. So I suspect what's happening is that inside of the chassis rail, all inside of here, there's probably oil and all kinds of stuff that's been pulled up through the weld. So it's still porous. You can, if it'll focus close enough, yeah, you can still see that it's porous there. It's not happening anywhere else, so I think there's just a problem there. So I'm just going to crack on and hope that I don't encounter any more issues. Next thing I'm going to do is where that green line is, I'm going to level these two pillars off so that it's level with that green line, and then I'm going to make a cap to go over the top, and that's what our engine mount is going to bolt to. Talk about the actual engine mount itself. If you follow me on Instagram, you've already seen this, but here's a basic diagram of what I'm trying to do. To simplify it as much as possible, basically we're doing a vertical bush rather than a horizontal bush like we were doing last time. And the reason I want to do it that way is I feel that positioning the engine is going to be a lot easier if we do it that way, but I just think it's a design that I want to try out, so this is the way I'm going to do it. Basically we've got the bushing here in red. We've got the sleeve that goes down the middle of the bushing, and then it sits on a plate, and there's some gusseting here to strengthen it. This green part at the top, if you can even tell that it's green, is the plate that will attach to the engine side of the bracket. And then you've got a bolt that goes all the way through the middle and then into whatever it's going into. In this case, it'll be the plinth that we've been making. And is a exploded view of that. So I've already made a prototype, and this is it. Now ignore all the welding on there because, well, I just wanted to dial in my welder, and I was using this as a test piece. I'll let you be the judge of whether I actually got there or not.
Nope.
So this is the bushing that was originally in the version 1 mounts. What I've done is I've ground off the bottom lip. And the reason I've done that is so that it can be pressed down into this mount. I won't do that because the fit is so tight that I need a press to do it. I have done it with a vise, but it's a bit sketchy getting it out again, so I won't put it back in for now just to show you, but just imagine that that's in there like that. Now in my prototype I made an error and I cut the hole out the exact size, or the size of the inner diameter of this pipe. I shouldn't have done that. I should have made it smaller so that the bottom of this has something to rest on. Otherwise the whole weight is resting on this lip, which I don't want it to do. So there's going to be, so imagine that this part down here would actually, this hole would be a lot smaller. You'd probably have a washer there. You might have the plate which goes to the engine in between there like that, maybe another washer, and then underneath another washer, and then it would screw on underneath like that. So that's kind of what we're looking at like this. Now the hole at the bottom of here needs to be big enough that this washer can poke through. So this bolt and the washer can't touch this mount, because if it does, it completely circumvents the polyurethane bushing. So there needs to be a gap between the edge of this washer and the bottom of this mount. This is the basic design. It's going to be the same on both sides, engine and gearbox side. I don't see any reason why it needs to be any different. Additionally, once the mount is in like that, I will be putting a plate that goes between these two struts, gussets or whatever you want to call them, and that will sandwich that down. So it will stop the bush from coming out if, say, I don't know, the engine goes through some sort of weird torque event that pushes it out or tries to pull it out of the bushing, or tries to pull the bushing out of the mount. So there'll be a cap that goes around there. Again, won't touch the bolt or the washer, but it will screw down onto either side of here so that this is completely captured with inside of there. It's not going to try and come out. So this is the plate that caps off the chassis mount. Still needs a little bit of finalising, some trimming off there and there to get it to line up properly, but if we stick the prototype mount on there, these are the bolts that came out of the donor. So there should be a captive nut under there. Ignore the fact that these are shouldered. I would be using different hardware than this. So now all we need to do is just weld this to the top of the chassis mount. So with the test mount in, we can kind of see something that's a little bit concerning, and that's the whole thing is on the piss. So if you look at it from dead on, from in this direction, you can see that it's actually leaning inwards towards the center of the bay. And the reason why I consider that a problem is because you're going to have a load hanging over this, right? So the engine is going to be here where I'm sat, and on top of there will be a plate, and the engine will be pulling downwards. If this is straight up, that's not going to be so much of a problem. But if the mount is not exactly straight and it's leaning in this direction a bit, then what might happen is not only will the engine be pulling this mount downwards, which is fine because we've got the strength here, it's also going to try and pull it inwards. So there's going to be forces in this direction acting on it as well. Probably not that big a deal because it's not that far off, but I've already done this once before. I think it probably makes sense to just pull all of this off and try and do it straight. There's nothing on this chassis leg that's straight to the car. The car itself is now straight, it's now completely level, but the car, or at least this section of the car, is not straight. This is not straight, it slopes down in this direction over here. It also slopes inwards, so like a downward slope in this direction. That causes some problems. And also the whole chassis rail moves in this direction outwards, so they're splayed out slightly. So what that meant was that when I was trying to level these off in order to put this cap on, it was really difficult to get them all on the same plane, especially when I had no real frame of reference. So I just kind of eyeballed it, and clearly my eyeballing wasn't correct. So I'm going to take it all off. Hopefully, I've only just spot welded it in a few places, and we're going to start again and try a different method. Alright, so everything I just showed you was a massive waste of time. But I always like to try and show you my process, even if it doesn't end up working out. What I'm doing this time to try and get everything level is I'm using these threaded rods to make fine adjustments to everything. With the car now level, it's a lot easier to do this. I decided to change the design slightly. So instead of using that box section I was using before, I'm just going to use additional plates in the middle instead. And this is what we have. Much more simple design than the other one, basically just a flat top with some vertical struts. So I was able to stand on this and had no trouble with that. So this is mostly done just in some weld-free primer just to keep it from rusting. So now everything is nice and level where it wasn't before. It's not exactly dead on in this direction, and that's just because it's actually quite hard to get it flat entirely. I've got to try and manage this thing in two directions whilst also sizing these plates and then welding them in. It was a right pain, but it's much better than it was. The other ones were just completely out. Now you'll notice that this is still open on the front, so there will be a closing plate. I haven't decided whether that's going to be welded in or whether that's going to be a bolt-on affair. Maybe I'll put some bosses or something here and then it's removable, just in case you need to get to the nuts under here, maybe if they become uncaptive, or you need to get to the bushing underneath here. But I've decided to just leave it for now because it's plenty strong without it. I still need to weld up in there, so that's going to be a lot harder when this is all plated off. Welding wise, I don't know, I had a bit of a mixed bag with this. It's mostly tacked in places like here, you can see tacks, but I did also get a good couple of welds in on this side, so there and there. On the other side as well, it's also better welded in. Along the top, just got a couple of small tacks. They were mostly just to keep it in place whilst I positioned these. It just gave me a little bit of room to move the thing up and down. Eventually it will be properly welded in. Next, what I want to do, this is still wet at the moment so I can't put the mount on top, but is we'll fit the mount and then we'll get the engine in position, and we'll start making the plate that goes from the top to the engine and hopefully have it suspended on this one side. Obviously I'm not going to do that now because it's completely dark outside, so I'm going home. It's now the next day, so we're back at the mount, and what I was thinking was last night as I was lying in bed is that there's not an awful lot of like lateral strength going in that direction. So whilst it's plenty strong enough for the downward, you know, with all the weight on top of there, there's nothing stopping it from sort of resisting any movements backwards and forwards. And I think the easiest way to do that is just put some diagonals in here. I do plan on tidying this up by, I'm not sure if you can hear all that noise, sorry if you can, is to put some triangulation in the side here, just to make it look nicer. To also put some triangulation in here too. I did originally think that because I plan on putting a face on the front of here, that would also add quite a lot of strength, like a shear wall. But I want to keep this open because we need to be able to get to the bolt that's underneath the vertical bushing. So that does need to be open. So I could maybe cap just the ends off here, or I could just triangulate it off. Don't know yet, not sure what I'm going to do. But for the time being, what we're going to do today is we're going to get the engine back in the bay and then start making the transverse part of the mount. So the bit that basically bridges... No, that's the wrong side. So we need to make a bit that goes from the top of there to the top of that mount. Here's the factory mount, and it would normally attach sort of there. It's way too thick. If you look at the top, if I put that roughly in place, it sticks out quite a lot further than my mount does. So the reason I'm not using this mount and I'm using the existing mount is because its thickness is such that it actually pushes the whole engine sort of closer to this side of the car. God, that's so noisy about there. Yeah, so if I put that there, then basically I wouldn't be able to get the engine close enough to this side. It'll end up just hitting the chassis rail. So I've had to keep using this. In order to make it sort of dimensionally similar, I've put this extension on the top. And now, aside from being thinner, it's actually the same. It's kind of hard to see, but they do line up like that. So it's basically the same thing, except it's just doesn't stick out quite as far. I do plan on remaking this section. This bit of 3 centimeter box section is just a temporary measure. And the reason I'm going to remake it is because with the new mount, this whole section up here will be up higher, which means that this little bodge I've had to do with the nut will no longer be a problem because it will be further up. So let's get the engine in, and then hopefully get at least the engine side all mounted up by the end of today. Right, got the engine back in place, got the height, everything is all set up properly. So now we can get a good look at where we are with the mounts. So all I actually have to do now is make a plate that connects these 2 bolts to the top of this bolt. So just a little triangulated piece, and that will basically be the engine mount done. So let's make that next. Right, we've got the mount in. Sorry, there's a bit of a jump cut there to installing it, but I kind of needed the concentration to just get on with it. So as you can see, it's a little bit jank because I've got all those spacers under the engine side. That's just because I need to remake that mount, as I mentioned earlier, but it seems to be working pretty well. If we look over dead on, you can see there's a little bit of lean. So it is pulling the mount over just a little bit. But I think that that's because the way I've got this set up at the moment is I've just got the engine crane holding up the gearbox side. The actual engine itself is only really slightly held up. So everything seems to be holding up okay. And I think the reason why it's leaning as much as it is because there's no support aside from lifting up on this side. There's nothing else, so there will be some support over the gearbox side, and because of how high we got the engine up in the bay now, there might even be room to fit this factory cross member, longitudinal cross member that goes from the old radiator support that was here to the back. I'm going to have to modify the one that I made to accept 2 holes there, but that will give us 2 additional bushings, which will give us some more support, and will give us 4 points of contact. So I'm going to end it here because it's taken me this long to get to the point where I can show you even this. And yeah, my upload schedule is already down the drain, so I'm going to end it here. But next video you'll hopefully see the gearbox side done. It's basically going to be the same thing as that. Quite a bit of work, bit of a setback, but hopefully we can crack on moving forward. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.